Good morning, everyone. Today, you and I are going to talk about native mobile apps versus hybrid applications. So let's get into it. Let's start by defining some things. What is a native app? A native mobile app is if you are on iOS or whether, if you're on Android, basically. It is an application that is running on the actual, basically that it has no middle ground. It doesn't have anything in between it. It basically it's compiled down to the native code that is running on the phone. So in Android, that would be something like Java, for example. And in iOS, it's going to be Objective-C or Swift, whichever you prefer to be using. And a hybrid application is an in-between type of thing. It is something like, I suppose you could call React Native a hybrid application. It's not exactly a hybrid. I'll explain the difference in just a moment. But basically, a hybrid application is something like PhoneGap or Cordova or something of that nature, where basically you have an application that is internally running a web page. You use web technologies such as CSS and JavaScript and so forth in order to get a native feel to the application. And you can of course you have an interface between your web technology and the phone that is provided to you by Cordova and so forth, so that you can actually do native things, because you may know that web technologies don't have the same type of power and access as native stuff has, which is by necessity. And a lot of people especially people who start working in JavaScript, I've seen this question a few times on Stack Overflow, where they ask, okay, how do I access a file or something like that in JavaScript from the browser? And they're very surprised to learn that you can't actually do that, because JavaScript is not allowed to touch the file system from the browser, because that's a massive security risk. If you think about it, that would mean that a hacker, for example, could post a script that starts messing up your computer on a web page, and all they have to do is get you to click a link, and all of a sudden they stole a bunch of files or did something with your file system. So that is a massive security vulnerability. But let's talk about the pros and cons with these two things, because I have a bit of experience working with both of these. So I started using PhoneGap and Cordova, or I'm going to call it PhoneGap. I know it's Cordova, but like for me it's PhoneGap, because that's like when I was using it. And basically, what's good about this is that you can very quick, if you're not a mobile expert or anything like that, it's very easy for you to get started, and you can basically use your web technology know-how to create a mobile application. And what another benefit of it is that you will have something that runs on all platforms. It's universal, because you run it on both iOS and on Android, which is a massive time saver if you're aiming towards running on both these platforms. Now, I will also say though that I've made two of these applications for two different companies, and I can tell you that, and I've also worked with some people who have actually been trying to do something similar, where they're mixing a web experience with a native experience, and I'll talk about that as well. So although that there is a benefit in terms of speed and delivery and being able to ship something to both platforms, I want to touch on something that I think it was actually the React Native team who made this I think that they got it right. And I think that was the idea that was being pitched back in the day about these hybrid apps it wasn't the right assumption. So let's define something. I will argue that a user expects a certain type of experience when they're interacting with something. It's something Apple does this better than anybody. They educate people in certain users' experiences and patterns and commonality. And it's actually, I argue, why Material UI and all these different standards are coming forward, because we want to the industry wants to get away from everybody recreating their own user experience, and to standardize on certain behaviors so that we can start shipping things that are consistent and feels natural to the users. And that makes a lot of sense. The problem is that now you have to agree on a standard, which is absolutely horrible. Agreeing on a standard takes a lot of time. And what basically happens is that because there is a expected user behavior and an expected way of working, the idea of a hybrid application that runs on all platforms actually kind of falls away. And the reason why it falls away is because whenever you design something for Android, or you start designing for Android, you're going to find that there's a lot of behavior, such as the back button, the forward, like all of these things work in a very specific way on an Android phone, and it works in a different manner on an iOS phone. So now you're in the position that you can choose to create interactions that are specific to one platform and works the same way on the other platform, or you have to create an in-between that doesn't work very well on either of them. And you have the performance issue as well. I can tell you from experience myself that if you have, like React Native has this problem as well, the graphics rendering engine and actually doing UI layouts and like mobile games is very unperformant on a native phone, even if you're using something like React Native. So it's kind of, it is right for some things, and I'll touch on what I think that you should be using these applications for, and what you shouldn't be using them for, in my opinion, is something like this. Like, you should not use hybrid applications to do like mobile games and stuff of that nature, because you do actually lose a lot of performance when you're doing this. So I would say that my general feel about these hybrid applications, depending on what you're using now, but something for like PhoneGap, for example, where you literally run a web page in your app, I think that you should avoid this if at all possible. That has been my experience. I have worked, when I was working for like one of the larger companies, like they had their own web experience, like a mobile experience, where literally their system was not able to, like they couldn't in a reasonable amount of time create a native feel app for their system. So they created this awkward in-between app where some of it is in web and some of it is in native, and it doesn't make a nice experience for the user. The conversion rate on the phone application for this massive company is ridiculously low, and at the end of the day, just having a mobile app isn't giving you any value if nobody's using it. So I will argue on average, it's better to, at least that's what I found, to start by creating something for one platform with the native stuff, and then transition over to a new platform or the other platform when you're getting some traction. And React Native made this very clear, I think, that a lot of people started thinking, when they were released, because the difference between React Native and something like PhoneGap is that React Native actually compiles down to the native code. It's not a web interface running in the browser, if you will. And the idea that they had is that you can use the common interface for something like React to transpile your code down to, whatever it is that you're making. So you can transpile it down to Android, or you can transpile it down to iOS. And I've talked to a lot of people about this who are using this technology. And my rule of thumb when it comes to this is that you need to, if you're going to use something like React Native, you have to ask the two questions. First and foremost, do you need performance? Such as if you're making a mobile game. Because if you're doing something like that, the performance that React Native is going to give you is not going to be ideal. I've seen it being done, and we actually had to remake it in the native stuff because it simply couldn't keep up. Because you should not kid yourself. There's no such thing as something that's just better. When you're using these in-between hybrids, you are putting something on top of the native stuff, which means that you are losing something. You're always losing something. It's not the same thing, and therefore you are losing something. When does it make sense to use it? I would say that the best argument I've ever heard was from Klarna when I was talking to them about why are you using React Native? And they explained that one of the problems they have is that they don't want to have a very diverse ecosystem of developers. They realized that if they have a lot of really talented JavaScript developers and they don't have much in terms of a performance issue with their application, which makes sense, it's not a high performance type of application they're building. So they realized that they could focus on becoming the best at JavaScript and having really good JavaScript developers, and simply having them using something like React Native to create the mobile experience, instead of creating too much of a diverse ecosystem with people who know only Android or people who are experts in iOS, and make them work together. And that's actually a really strong use case, because they need the app for iOS and for Android, but they don't have the people, like they don't have the experts in each field, so they focus on one single field. And that's actually very smart. I think that's the best use case for it. So that's what I would use it for as well. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, I need an iOS application and an Android application, and basically I have limited time and limited amounts of development experience and so forth, I would say that React Native is a really good choice. But I will also say that it's a very, like, if you can, favor using the native stuff, because it's going to be more future-proof, and it's not going to have a lot of the limitations that you will find with these in-between hybrid applications. That's at least from my experience. I would say, like, my approach has been that, you know, I remember when people asked me, why don't you use React Native for yours, like own application development and so forth? And I said, well, I know both Java and Swift. So there's no, and since I'm really only focusing on building one thing for one platform to begin with, and then if it has traction, like if for your own startup, don't think that just because, don't go big. Start by creating a specific thing for a specific use group and see if you get traction, and then you can transition into the next thing. So if you're creating your own company, own startup, starting with React Native I think it's a bad choice. Start with one platform and then see if that works, and then go into the next one. But if you're someone like Klarna who needs it, it's absolutely amazing. Hopefully this was useful for